The first people to belong to the land were Indians. Their early history has been romanticized, criticized, and distorted in hundreds of ways. Few have been able to understand Native American history in all its complexity. For one thing, the great diversity among tribes defies broad generalization.
We often speak of Indians as though they hadn't been separate tribes and nations, as though distinctions between Cheyenne and Blackfeet, between Gros Ventre and Flathead, did not exist. We forget that Flathead Indians foraged food in the Bitterroot Valley. We forget the Crow planted crops before they migrated to Montana. We forget the Kootenai cultivated tobacco. Despite the different cultures, customs, and beliefs, Native Americans on the Great Plains did share a common bond. That was the buffalo. For hundreds and perhaps thousands of years, Indians living in Montana depended upon the buffalo for survival.
A buffalo rock is a small, odd-shaped piece of fossil shell or flint that is sometimes found on the plains. The Blackfeet consider an individual who finds a stone to be exceptionally fortunate. And such a stone has a power over the buffalo. It has the power to attract them and thus keep them from starvation. The buffalo rock, it is said, makes a chirping sound like that of a small bird. And if a warrior is riding across the plains and hears this sound coming from the ground, he knows that there is a buffalo rock around. And he usually stops to look for it, and he finds it. It's fine. But if he doesn't, he marks the spot in some way, goes back to his village, brings others to help him find the rock and to locate the stone. And once it is found, it is the source of much happiness, because then the Blackfeet know that they will be assured of a continuing food supply in the form of the buffalo. They have a story about the first buffalo rock. They said that a long time ago, which is a long time even before the Blackfeet had horses, that the buffalo disappeared one severe winter. And there was so much snow that they could hardly walk around. And the Blackfeet lived on small game and animals until they too were gone, and the people were starving. One young man somehow managed to find a jackrabbit, and he rushed it home for cooking. And he told one of his wives to go and get some water to cook the rabbit. There was no water in the lodge, of course, and so she had to go down to the river to get some. And while she was on her way down, she heard this beautiful song. And she looked around to see where the sound was coming from, couldn't locate it, and finally located a small rock that was lodged in the fork of a cottonwood tree. And along with the rock were some buffalo hairs that had become entangled when a buffalo had rubbed against the tree. And of course, the woman was very frightened and didn't want to go near this rock. But the rock talked to her and told her to take it to her lodge. The rock further instructed her to assemble the people after dark and to teach them the song that she had heard. She went back and, with the assistance of her husband, assembled the people in her lodge, taught them the song that she had heard, and also told them to pray that the buffalo would return and that they, as the Blackfeet, would not starve. So they learned the songs and they prayed as instructed, and pretty soon they heard the noise of approaching buffalo. And the next morning, when they came out of their lodges, they saw that the area around them, even though there was still snow, was covered with buffalo. So to the Blackfeet today, the buffalo rock is still very powerful, and it is still well taken care of, because even though the buffalo may be gone, it still assures them of a continuing food supply.
The myths reveal how the Indian was destined to use the buffalo. The systematic, well-organized buffalo hunt shows how well the Indian succeeded.
The general impression that we get about bison procurement in the Great Plains is that the peoples came together during the spring and summer months, after which they organized a very large communal hunt, which involved a good many people in the various temporary villages established in parts of the Great Plains area. That at that time, by driving buffalo over a cliff, hundreds and perhaps even more animals were killed at a single event. This was a very efficient food procurement strategy, and that the meat, the hides, the other products of such hunts were sometimes sufficient to carry the people on through the depriving winter months when the greatest hardship beset people adapted to the plains area. We do know archaeologically that bison were effectively hunted year-round, that although the major communal hunts were operated once or twice each year, that small groups of hunters occasionally went out during the winter and even early spring months and killed bison by ambush. Small groups of men could arrange to drive bison into snowdrifts, into box canyons, or other settings where a limited number of men could effectively kill bison. The arrival and adoption of the horse among the Plains Indians did not, of course, immediately bring about major changes in lifestyle. The impact was gradual. But probably in the area of buffalo procurement, the horse did make an almost immediate difference. Now that the hunters and warriors had the horse, they could range out at considerable distance from short-term settlements, where they could, generally by chase on horseback, still most often using the bow and arrow as an effective weapon in close, they would chase and kill fairly substantial numbers of animals. They could harvest as much as they needed on any given occasion, and continued use of the bow and arrow allowed them to identify the kills made by each warrior, which you couldn't do, of course, using a firearm. There isn't much evidence that the horse was used to drive bison over cliffs, though occasionally we do find some metal trade points among the bone midden remains, the residues of bison butchering and processing. The horse, of course, allowed the transport of killed bison. It would take 2 horses to carry back the remains of, say, a mature cow back to a settlement where they could be dumped. In this case, the people don't have to go out to the kill sites and then selectively butcher the animals and only bring back the best parts. In this way, they could very efficiently bring the meat back to the camp where it could be used for the benefit of all of the people.
Europeans changed Indian life when they introduced the horse. The mobility, size, and wealth of Indian tribes was limited as long as dogs served as beasts of burden. The horse changed all that by making the Indians better hunters. The kill no longer involved the entire community. Men alone could kill buffalo faster and more efficiently. With more hides and more meat, the lodges grew bigger and wealthier. The Indians could now move with greater ease into new territory. At the same time, however, the horse forced Native Americans to become more mobile. Once horses had grazed out the land, the tribe had to move on to support the horses.
Other changes, deadly changes, occurred with the arrival of whites, when 2 different biological worlds collided. With the exchange of new diseases, native populations were decimated by the thousands. The explorers from Spain, France, the Netherlands, England, found a rich land, almost empty. They called the land's few inhabitants savages to justify taking their land. By mistake, they called them Indians.
The Europeans recognized the legal and moral claim Indians had to this new land, but since the natives didn't use it in the same way Europeans would, explorers and settlers felt vindicated in moving in. So the Indians were subdued, exterminated, and pushed westward. Some data indicate the Blackfeet once lived north of the Great Lakes. Meanwhile, the great European empires clashed in the Old World and in the New. Montana, so far north, so far west, saw few Europeans for centuries. But as new territories were claimed and sought, interest in the West grew. And it grew in our own country, not just in Europe. In January 1803, President Thomas Jefferson wrote Captain Meriwether Lewis, "The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal streams of it, to determine what river may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across the continent for the purposes of commerce." So Captain Lewis and Lieutenant Clark traveled up the Missouri. In Montana, they find the Yellowstone. They name the Milk River. They name the Judith and the Mussel Shell. They name Mariah's River, and for a time they believe it is the Missouri, but the Great Falls convince them it's not. An Indian guide, Sacagawea, assists the military expedition. Up into the Rockies they go, until they reach Three Forks, headwaters of the Missouri. Another group reached Montana just a few months later. Led by David Thompson, who represented the Northwest Company, the explorers came south out of Canada. Thompson surveyed the headwaters of the Columbia, Kootenai, and Clark Fork rivers, and within a few years established several fur trading posts in the northwest corner of the state. Fur trading forts soon replaced the random outposts as competition for fur grew. For a time, two Canadian-based British companies controlled the market. Northwest Company and Hudson's Bay Company carried their rivalry throughout Canada and the Pacific Northwest. Even though Hudson's Bay Company absorbed the Northwesters in 1821, British control of the trade faltered. A new competitor, John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company, pushed the British trade west of the Continental Divide. The British had done well thus far, largely because they hired trappers as company employees. The American Fur Company did well because it controlled trade along the Missouri River. And a new competitor did well because it initiated the rendezvous. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company arranged a meeting of any and all trappers each year. During the meeting, called Rendezvous, the company bought pelts from anyone who wanted to sell. By being mobile and having little capital invested in employees, Rocky Mountain Fur succeeded in running a profitable enterprise for a time. When easy trapping played out, however, it was the American Fur Company that survived. Now headed by Pierre Choteau, the company's river connections, as well as its big investment, gave it life beyond the 1840s and on into the 50s, 60s, and even the 1870s. The fur trappers were men on the make, small-time entrepreneurs. They came north to get their fortunes and then get out of here. A.B. Guthrie said it more poetically. "We ascend the river only for the return." These forest businessmen bagged their own skins or traded beads, gunpowder, and alcohol for pelts Indians trapped. Indians provided both fur companies and individual trappers and traders a large percentage of business. They soon became pawns in the fur trade and began to lose their economic independence. After all, they needed gunpowder for the guns whites had given them. They needed horses. They needed whiskey.
Most of the furs that were harvested that come from off the mountain areas were in fact hunted, trapped, skinned, processed, and then delivered to the mountain men for their trading. Now, of course, the mountain men engaged in some fur trading too, but the vast majority of it was done by the Indians. If we expand the definition of fur trade to meaning buffalo hides, the same thing would still be true. Something over 100,000 buffalo hides a year passed through St. Louis. Probably 75 to 80,000 of those were actually hunted and provided by Indians. So in a sense that the fur trade existed at all, it existed because the Indians were there as the hunters to provide the furs. It's unlikely that in the absence of Indians there would have been more white hunters than there actually were. So they're absolutely fundamental to it. It literally would not have existed in the absence of Indians. Now, The effect on them specifically was that it gave them something to trade, something that they had not had in any large quantity before, something of value. They certainly had always been trade among Indian peoples for a variety of things, but it was not fundamental to their life. They could survive without it. Once they commit themselves to the fur trade, and fur trading becomes a very major part of their own existence, they also become dependent upon those to whom they're trading those furs. And this comes in a variety of ways. The obvious things of implements, guns, pots, kettles, but in some ways, even for those fundamental things that sustain life. What we know now, and has been overlooked for a great long time, that one of the major products in that fur trade was foodstuffs. And in fact, rather than living off the buffalo and off of hunting, most of that is being wasted now for the hides, and a good deal of the foodstuffs that Indians are consuming is actually acquired in the trade. That was consistent from the very earliest years of the fur trade in the East Coast, and continues to be true right through the fur trading period through the Great Plains and into the Rocky Mountains. So it has a fundamental effect on their ability to act independently. Consequently, if they are not going to be independent, you begin to change the social character of these people, again, rather fundamentally. For example, and perhaps the easiest example to point out, these were basically meritorious societies. That is, that those who led the society are identified by the group as a whole. And it's done on a basis of the values and those things which were most important to them. Basically, a leader would be identified as a good hunter, a good provider, a good warrior, one who could protect them. He would also be generous with others, and he'd also be a good horse thief. Fundamental. A good Blackfeet warrior is someone who's identified as being able to steal Crow horses. A good Crow warrior is someone who can steal Blackfeet horses. It's fundamental to them. How do they determine who that is? Simply by whoever performs. Now, though, with the fur trade, there's a new element here. Who can provide you the avenue for getting goods into your society? That likely in the earlier years is coincident with the meritorious leaders. But as time goes on, it's simply those who perhaps marry one of the into the white society with one of the traders. It'll be those who have connections in one way or another with the fur trade itself, which will give them a status in the society that simply didn't exist before. And although you can still claim toward the end of the fur trading period that the meritorious society still exists, it clearly is a different meritorious society than had been there before the fur trade.
Indians were weakened further by smallpox epidemics that swept through fur fort and Indian village alike. One observer who visited a Blackfeet village during the 1837 epidemic found hundreds of decaying forms of human beings, horses, and dogs that lay scattered everywhere among the lodges.
Throughout the years of disease and trade, explorers continued to chart a territory still largely unknown. They worked at filling in the gaps in the scientific understanding left by the Lewis and Clark expedition. Nearly 50 years after Lewis and Clark reached the headwaters of the Missouri River, two other American explorers retraced their steps. Governor Isaac Stevens surveyed the northern route of the Lewis and Clark Trail for possible railroad routes. Captain Reynolds came to Montana to discover all the tributaries of the Yellowstone River and the headwaters of the Gallatin and Madison rivers. Reynolds' survey was more than just a mapping expedition, however.
The War Department wanted Reynolds to find out all he could about the land's agricultural and settlement possibilities, and to ascertain as far as practicable everything relating to the number, habits, and disposition of the Indians inhabiting the country. Almost 5 years earlier, the Stevens expedition resulted in new treaties with Indians living in Montana. It began as a survey for a northern railroad route, and in 1853, Isaac Stevens, first governor of Washington Territory, found 5 passes across the Rocky Mountain Divide: the Lolo, Hell Gate Pass, the Lewis and Clark, Cadeau's Pass, and the Marias, the northernmost pass. It would take another half-century to find it again, but it would become the key to James J. Hill's Transcontinental Railroad. In a separate visit, Stevens returned to Montana in 1855. At that time, he opened a major council with representatives of the Flathead, Pend Oreille, and Kootenai tribes. Later that same year, he negotiated with the Blackfeet. Stevens' negotiations created agreement among Indians in Montana. The Blackfeet agreed to share their hunting land with Indians from the Northwest. The negotiations also promoted peace between Indian and non-Indian. The Salish Council opened much of western Montana to white development. The negotiations also created misunderstanding, however. By forming the immense Jocko Reservation in the Flathead Lake area, Stevens assumed the Flathead Indians would leave the Bitterroot Valley. The Flatheads did not think they had agreed to this, and the dispute would cause confusion and sorrow later. While the expeditions had obvious military purposes, their lasting value lives on in the vast amount of scientific data they gathered. Geologists, cartographers, zoologists, artists, and even photographers accompanied military officers and ordinary adventurers. They cataloged plants, animals, topography, weather, and left behind a wealth of information others would eventually exploit. The Stevens expedition, for example, convinced one member of the party to press for an overland wagon road from Fort Benton to Fort Walla Walla. Lieutenant Mullen encouraged Governor Stevens to ask the government for such a road. Stevens did, and the road was built. Once completed, the Mullen Road served as the major route for white settlers into the Pacific Northwest. Lieutenant Mullen credits discovery of the pass over the Coeur d'Alene Mountains to an Indian, Ignace Lamoose. Ignace was the son of the Iroquois Indian who helped bring the Catholic religion to the Flathead Indians. Beginning with Father de Schmidt, Catholic priests traveled throughout the American wilderness to Christianize the Indians. The black-robed missionaries came to Montana at the height of the fur trade, the height of disease, drunkenness, and disgrace among Native Americans.
They came actually at the invitation of the Flathead Indians, surprisingly enough. The Indians who were living in the Bitterroot Valley had heard of the Catholic faith and of the Jesuit fathers, whom they referred to as black robes, through some Iroquois Indians who had come from Canada into Montana with the Hudson's Bay Fur Company. And some of these Iroquois had eventually settled in the Bitterroot Valley with the Flatheads. They, of course, had been exposed to the Jesuits back in Canada and told them a number of stories about them. They also taught them some of the rudiments of the Catholic faith, some of the prayers, the sign of the cross, some very basic beliefs. And the Indians, of course, were a very religious people and became very interested in these black robes and asked how they could get black robes. And they were told that they would have to go seek them out. And so between 1830 and 1840, the Flatheads sent 4 separate delegations to St. Louis seeking priests. And Father de Smet answered the call in 1840 and came to Montana to see how things were going and whether it was possible to establish a mission, and then returned to St. Louis, convinced the bishop there that a mission was very possible. And so in 1841, then Fathers de Smet, Mangarini, and Point returned to Montana and established St. Mary's Mission in Stevensville. Many of these priests were trained not only in theology, but were trained in medicine, in woodworking, carpentry, a number of different skills to prepare them for their work on the missions, because the work was much more than theological. They were teachers, they were doctors, they were builders. The Flatheads readily accepted the Fathers. There was very little problem in their accepting the Fathers and accepting the Catholic faith. You read some of the early accounts, or some of Father de Smet's accounts, or Father Ravalli's accounts. They talk about large numbers of baptisms occurring, mainly at some of the major holidays, at Christmas and at Easter. Tremendous numbers of Indians being baptized, marriages being blessed, marriages that had already taken place were blessed within the Catholic faith. The Indians began bringing their children to be baptized, and that's even true today. You'll find that many Indians will want their children baptized as soon as possible after birth.
The missionaries had some success, and perhaps their voices from the wilderness argued against the total extermination of the Indians. But a new God was on the horizon, a God indifferent to Indian and non-Indian alike. That God was gold.